January 17th, 1892, Exeter, Rhode Island. The grave was opened in the dead of winter. Snow lay thick across the Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island, as townsmen gathered around a freshly dug pit. Inside the coffin lay Mercy Lena Brown, dead for barely 2 months. When the lid was lifted, gasps followed. Her body showed little decay. There was blood in her heart. To the frightened villagers, this was not science, it was proof. That same day, Mercy's heart and liver were cut from her body, carried to a nearby rock, and burned to ashes. The ashes were mixed into a tonic and fed to her dying brother, Edwin Brown, in the desperate belief that she was a vampire draining his life from beyond the grave. This ritual, brutal and tragic, marked one of the last vampire panics in American history. To understand why it happened, we must go back. The story of the Brown family in Exeter, Rhode Island, begins quietly, without spectacle, the way most real tragedies do. There were no warnings, no sudden calamities, only a gradual tightening of fear around a single household that, over time, came to be viewed with suspicion rather than sympathy. Exeter in the late 19th century was a rural town where people knew one another's routines, illnesses, and losses. When death appeared more than once at the same address, it did not go unnoticed. George Brown was a farmer by trade, a man rooted in habit and responsibility. He and his wife, Mary Eliza Brown, lived a life that was unremarkable in every sense. Work in the fields, church on Sundays, and long winters spent indoors with their children, Edwin and Mercy Lena. Nothing in the family's history suggested scandal or instability. Yet by the early 1880s, something had entered the Brown home that could not be ploughed under or prayed away. In 1883, Mary Eliza Brown died. The cause was recorded as consumption, the wasting disease that had already taken thousands across New England. Consumption did not strike quickly. It hollowed people out over months or years, leaving families to watch as strength vanished and breath became a labor. Mary's death, though tragic, was not unusual for the time. What made it unsettling was what followed. Within a year of his mother's burial, Edwin Brown began to show the same signs. He grew thin. His coughing worsened. Neighbors noticed how often he stayed indoors, how rarely he worked the fields. Consumption had returned, and this time it lingered. Edwin did not die quickly. His illness stretched on year after year, turning him into a constant reminder that the disease had not finished with the Brown family. At this point, no one spoke openly of curses or supernatural causes. Tuberculosis was common enough, even if poorly understood. Yet the unease had begun. In a town like Exeter, patterns mattered. When sickness repeated itself inside a single family, people noticed. When it refused to leave, they began to speculate. By 1889, speculation hardened into fear. Mercy Lena Brown, the youngest of the family, started coughing. She was still a teenager, known as quiet and dutiful, often helping at home while her brother remained weak. When her health declined, the signs were unmistakable: weight loss, pallor, fatigue. The same illness had now touched 3 members of the household, 2 of them still alive but clearly wasting away. From a modern perspective, the explanation is straightforward. Tuberculosis is contagious, especially within close living quarters. But in rural Rhode Island in the 1880s, germ theory was not common knowledge. Many physicians still debated how disease spread, and among ordinary townspeople, explanations came from older sources: tradition, folklore, and inherited belief. Consumption, in particular, inspired dread because it behaved unlike other illnesses. It did not strike down its victims swiftly. It seemed to drain them slowly, as if something were feeding on their vitality. In European folklore, and later in New England, this resemblance mattered. The language used to describe the disease, consumed, wasted, drained, mirrored the language of vampirism long before anyone in Exeter spoke the word aloud. As the Browns endured loss after loss, their home became a point of quiet observation. Neighbours watched Edwin grow weaker. They saw Mercy fade. They remembered Mary's death. These were not three isolated tragedies in the public mind. They were one continuous event, unfolding over nearly a decade. People began asking questions that had no medical answers. Why had the disease not left the family? Why did it return again and again? Why did the living grow weaker even after the dead were buried? George Brown himself struggled with these questions. He had buried his wife, watched his son suffer for years, and now faced the likely death of his daughter. Medical advice offered little comfort. Rest, fresh air, relocation. None of it worked. Edwin was sent away briefly in hopes that a change of climate might help him. But the illness followed him back home. Fear thrives where certainty is absent. In Exeter, certainty was in short supply. By the end of the 1880s, whispers circulated more freely. Some townspeople recalled older stories, beliefs brought from Europe generations earlier, about the dead feeding on the living. These stories were not treated as superstition at first, but as possible explanations when all others failed. The idea was simple and terrifying. One member of the family might not be truly at rest. Instead, they were believed to be drawing life from those still alive, causing consumption to persist. Such beliefs did not emerge from cruelty. They emerged from desperation. Families who accepted these explanations believed they were acting to save the living, not punish the dead. The fact that multiple members of the Brown family fell ill in sequence only strengthened the theory. By the time Mercy Brown's condition worsened in the early 1890s, the family was no longer viewed merely as unlucky. They were seen as marked. Each cough, each loss of appetite, each pale morning added weight to a growing conviction that something unseen was at work inside the Brown household. What is most telling when examined closely is how slowly this belief developed. There was no single moment when the town declared the Browns cursed. Instead, the idea accumulated gradually, fed by time, repetition, and helplessness. Each funeral reinforced it. Each relapse confirmed it. The stage was set long before Mercy Brown died. By the time her health failed completely, fear had already replaced reason in the minds of many. The community was prepared, not for mourning, but for intervention. What followed would not have been possible without this long build-up of suspicion. The exhumation, the burning, the ritual itself, all of it began here in the quiet years when disease was mistaken for intent and suffering was interpreted as evidence. This was not yet a story of graves and fire. It was an investigation shaped by grief, carried out without science and driven by a belief that death, once begun, must have a source. And in Exeter, the source was believed to lie within the Brown family itself. By the 19th century, New England had developed its own quiet mythology around disease, shaped by fear, isolation, and centuries-old European folklore. Tuberculosis moved through families with a patience that made it especially terrifying. It did not arrive like plague or fever, striking all at once. Instead, it lingered, passing from one body to another, weakening its victims slowly. In communities where medical knowledge was limited, this pattern felt intentional. When several members of a single household sickened and died, people did not see coincidence. They saw design. The belief was simple and deeply unsettling. One of the dead was not truly dead. Instead, that person was thought to be feeding on the living, drawing strength from them and leaving illness behind. Consumption, with its wasting symptoms, seemed to confirm the idea. The living grew thinner. Their energy disappeared. Their breath shortened, To many, it looked as though life itself was being stolen night by night. This belief shaped how bodies were interpreted after burial. When graves were opened weeks or months later, normal processes of decomposition were misunderstood as signs of undeath. A corpse that decayed slowly was not seen as preserved by cold, but suspected of resisting death. Blood found in the heart or liver, something entirely natural, was taken as proof that the body was still active. Skin that appeared fresh, lips that had not fully darkened, or nails that seemed longer, all fed the same conclusion. In truth, shrinking skin made hair and nails appear to grow, and winter temperatures slowed decay. But these explanations belonged to a science that had not yet reached towns like Exeter. Instead, people relied on what they could see and what they had been taught to fear. Stories passed down through generations filled the gaps left by medicine. These were not the dramatic vampires of later fiction, but something quieter and closer to home. A relative buried nearby, unknowingly harming those they once loved. By 1891, Edwin Brown's condition had become impossible to ignore. Years of illness had left him frail, coughing, and barely able to work. His mother was dead. His sister was weakening. From the outside, it looked as though the disease was following a pattern, moving through the family, refusing to release its grip. Neighbors began to talk more openly. They did not accuse out of malice, but out of fear. If the cause could be identified, perhaps it could be stopped. George Brown listened. He had watched his family vanish piece by piece, and every practical solution had failed. Doctors could not help. Time only made things worse. When neighbors suggested that something unnatural might be responsible, the idea no longer sounded absurd. It sounded like the only explanation left. By then, fear had hardened into conviction. The illness was no longer seen as random. It was believed to be coming from somewhere, from someone already buried. And once that belief took hold, it demanded action. November of 1891 arrived early and cold in Exeter, Rhode Island. Winter settled over the town with unusual speed, hardening the ground and sealing the earth before many of the season's dead could be buried. It was during this time that Mercy Lena Brown, the youngest member of the Brown family, finally succumbed to the illness that had stalked her household for years. She was only 19 years old when she died. Her body weakened by tuberculosis. Her life narrowed to breath and pain long before it ended. Unlike her mother and her brother, who had suffered through the warmer months, Mercy died as the land froze solid. The cemetery soil could not be opened, and so her burial was delayed. Instead of being placed in the ground, her body was stored in a temporary above-ground crypt, a common practice in New England during severe winters. To modern eyes, the decision was practical and unremarkable. To the people of Exeter, however, it would later become deeply significant. Mercy's body remained sealed in the cold, preserved by the winter air. Time passed, but decay came slowly. While her body rested untouched, life inside the Brown household continued to unravel. Edwin Brown, who had been ill for years, grew visibly worse. His strength diminished rapidly, his coughing intensified, and his weight dropped until he appeared scarcely alive. Each day that he declined while Mercy's body remained intact strengthened the unease already gripping the community. The timing disturbed people. Mercy had died, yet Edwin continued to fade. In the logic of folklore, this seemed backwards. If consumption passed naturally, the death of one family member should have ended the cycle. Instead, the illness persisted. To frighten neighbors, it appeared as though death itself had not finished its work. Whispers began quietly. They passed from kitchen to kitchen, from church pews to country roads. Some recalled old beliefs, stories told by grandparents about the restless dead, about those who died too soon or were buried improperly. Mercy's body, lying above ground rather than beneath it, became the center of these murmurs. She had not been placed in the earth. She had not fully returned to it. In the minds of many, this mattered. The idea took hold that Mercy had not truly died, not in the way that her mother had, not in the way that death was supposed to work. Her youth, her recent burial, and the cold preservation of her body combined into something suspicious. Each worsening cough from Edwin seemed to confirm it. People began to believe that Mercy's death was incomplete, that something of her remained active, drawing strength from the living. George Brown was surrounded by this talk, even if he did not invite it. He had buried his wife, watched his son waste away, and now mourned his daughter. He was exhausted, grieving, and desperate. When neighbors suggested that Mercy's unusual burial might explain Edwin's decline, he did not immediately dismiss the idea. Nothing else had helped. Science had offered no answers. Faith had offered no relief. By the end of November, Mercy Brown was no longer seen simply as a victim of disease. In the fearful imagination of the town, she had become something else, a possible source of the suffering that refused to end. The cold that preserved her body would soon preserve her place in history, not as a young woman lost to illness, but as the center of one of America's most disturbing acts of belief-driven investigation. On the morning of January 17, 1892, the tension in Exeter, Rhode Island, reached its peak. The Brown family had endured nearly a decade of suffering, and the local community, steeped in fear and superstition, demanded action. Under immense pressure, and reportedly against his better judgment, George Brown consented to a practice that would forever mark his family in history: the exhumation of 3 graves. Among them were his late wife, Mary Eliza Brown, his daughter, Mercy Lena Brown, and a deceased relative whose identity has been less recorded, but whose presence was meant to confirm the ritual's validity. When the coffins were opened, the results were startling. Mary Eliza Brown's body, deceased for nearly a decade, had decomposed as expected. But Mercy's body, buried only a few months earlier and preserved in the bitter cold of winter, appeared remarkably intact. Her skin retained color, her features were discernible, and most strikingly, her organs contained liquid blood. To modern science, this was entirely normal. Blood can remain in vessels for months, especially in low temperatures. But to 19th century eyes, already primed by folklore and fear, it was a sign of the unnatural, proof that Mercy had not truly died and was somehow feeding upon the living. Driven by the belief that the undead were the source of Edwin Brown's wasting illness, the community performed a ritual that seems shocking today, but was consistent with local folklore at the time. Mercy's heart and liver were removed from her preserved body. A symbolic act meant to sever the source of her supposed power. These organs were placed on a nearby stone and burned to ashes. The fire intended to cleanse the vampire's influence, but the ritual did not end there. The ashes were carefully collected and mixed with water to create a tonic. In the eyes of the townspeople, this was a medicine of last resort, a means to save the remaining living. Edwin Brown, weakened and fading, was forced to drink the mixture, his family and neighbors convinced that ingesting the remnants of the alleged vampire would break the cycle of death. Every aspect of the ritual reflected the fusion of fear, grief, and the desperate logic of a community unacquainted with modern medical knowledge. To them, Mercy's preservation, the liquid blood in her organs, and Edwin's continued decline were all evidence of something supernatural. The act of burning and consuming the ashes was believed to destroy the vampire's influence, to end the curse, and to save the life of the young man who still lingered between illness and death. This exhumation and ritual, carried out in the cold midwinter of 1892, would later become one of the most famous cases of American vampire panic. It was not cruelty born of malice, but fear fused with ignorance, fear that led otherwise rational people to take extraordinary measures in an attempt to confront an invisible threat. What they perceived as intervention, history records as a tragic misinterpretation of disease and decay, a ritual born of desperation rather than malice, and a stark reminder of how superstition can guide human behavior when science is absent. By the time the ritual concluded, Mercy Brown's body had been destroyed in part, her ashes consumed by the very person her death was meant to protect. Yet the act did not end the disease. Edwin Brown, weakened by tuberculosis, would succumb 2 months later, proving that no ritual could alter the course of the illness. The exhumation and ritual remain a chilling testament to the intersection of grief, fear, and folklore in rural New England at the turn of the century. The story of Mercy Brown and the infamous vampire incident in Exeter, Rhode Island, concludes not with triumph over supernatural forces, but with the sober, tragic inevitability of disease. In March of 1892, just 2 months after the exhumation and the ritual designed to protect the living, Edwin Brown, Mercy's older brother, succumbed to tuberculosis. The very ritual that had been intended to stop his wasting illness had failed entirely. There were no miraculous recoveries, no end to the family's suffering, only the quiet, relentless progress of a disease that science now understood, but which the people of 19th century Exeter had interpreted through a lens of fear and folklore. Edwin's death marked a critical moment in the historical record. It became irrefutable evidence that Mercy Brown had never been a vampire. She had not drained her brother's life from beyond the grave. She had not risen from death to torment the living. Instead, she had been a young woman consumed by a disease that was poorly understood at the time, and whose preserved body, kept cold during the winter months, was tragically misread as proof of supernatural activity. In this sense, the ritual that the townspeople performed was not only ineffective, but also emblematic of a community gripped by fear. A fear that transformed grief and helplessness into the belief that the dead could harm the living. The historical significance of the Mercy Brown incident is manifold. It is widely cited as one of the last documented vampire panics in the United States. A moment when folklore, superstition, and medical ignorance intersected with devastating effect. The events were extensively reported in American newspapers at the time, attracting attention far beyond the small, rural community of Exeter. These accounts captured the imaginations of readers across the country, presenting the exhumation of Mercy Brown's body, the burning of her heart and liver, and the forced consumption of her ashes by her dying brother as both macabre and fascinating. For contemporary observers, the story was sensational, a real-life Gothic tale unfolding in the American countryside. Scholars of folklore and history have since examined the case in depth. It has become a point of study for folklorists, anthropologists, and historians, not only because of its unusual practices, but also because it reveals how people responded to the incomprehensible threat of disease in a time before modern medicine. The ritual itself, while horrifying to modern sensibilities, reflects a pattern repeated throughout human history. When a community lacks knowledge to explain illness or misfortune, it often resorts to cultural narratives or supernatural explanations to make sense of tragedy. In Exeter, tuberculosis, insidious, invisible, and relentless, was interpreted as the work of a vampire, a manifestation of the very human need to ascribe agency to forces that cannot otherwise be controlled. The cultural impact of the Mercy Brown incident extends beyond historical records. It became a lasting part of New England vampire folklore, influencing subsequent generations' understanding of the relationship between death, disease, and the supernatural. Local stories continue to reference the idea of the undead preying on the living, and the Brown case was often cited as an example of how fear could amplify and distort reality. Beyond the regional context, the the case is believed to have reached the literary imagination of Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, published in 1897. Stoker was known to have read American newspapers, and the sensational accounts of Mercy Brown's exhumation likely contributed to the contemporary fascination with vampires and the undead that suffused European literature at the turn of the century. Today, the physical trace of Mercy Brown's story remains quiet and solemn. Her grave is located in Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter. It is marked simply with her name and the dates of her birth and death. There is no mention of vampires, no hint of the extraordinary beliefs that once surrounded her remains. The simplicity of her grave belies the drama and tragedy that occurred in her name. It is a reminder that history often reduces the sensational to the ordinary, but the story behind that modest marker is among the darkest and most human in American folklore. The conclusion of Mercy Brown's story underscores a profound truth. This was never about monsters. It was about ignorance, fear, disease, and grief, and about the lengths to which humans will go when confronted with forces they cannot understand or control. The people of Exeter were not cruel or sadistic. They were desperate. They acted according to the knowledge and beliefs available to them, attempting to protect the living from a threat they believed was real. Mercy herself was not a creature of folklore. She was a young woman caught in a chain of misfortune. Her life cut short by tuberculosis, and her death misinterpreted through the lens of superstition. What makes the Mercy Brown incident particularly compelling is the intersection of the personal and the cultural. It is a story of a family devastated by illness, a town gripped by fear, and a society on the edge of scientific understanding. The narrative reflects the human need to find causality in tragedy, the desire to impose order on the chaos of disease and death. In Exeter, this need manifested as the belief in vampires and the enactment of a ritual that would forever immortalize Mercy Brown in the annals of American folklore. Her story remains a touchstone for the study of human behavior in crisis, a cautionary tale about the consequences of ignorance and fear, and a window into the cultural and medical history of 19th century America. Mercy Brown's life and death, once misinterpreted, now serve as enduring evidence of the human cost of superstition. Her tale is a stark reminder that history often masks the ordinary human suffering behind the extraordinary myths it inspires, and that the most frightening monsters are sometimes those born of fear and misunderstanding, rather than the dead themselves. In the end, Mercy Brown's narrative is not simply a story of death or ritual. It is a story of humanity, of the desperate measures people take to protect loved ones, and of the tragic consequences when knowledge lags behind fear. The incident captures the tension between the known and the unknown, between science and superstition, and between grief and reason. In studying it, we do not find vampires, but we find something equally instructive: the consequences of ignorance, the power of fear, and the resilience of memory that preserves even the most misunderstood of lives. Mercy Brown was not a monster. She was a human being, and her story, dark as it is, remains one of America's most poignant Gothic tragedies.